So this presentation is something that I've been contemplating on how to design for over 8 years now. It's something that is certainly unsavory to talk about, but the reality of the matter is there are issues in our society that need to be addressed, and I don't see anyone else addressing those issues, so this is going to be one of many presentations. There are a lot of other presentations that I'd like to do on the topic, but this one is strictly concerning the implications of modern pederasty. There is an unsavory association with pedophilia and pederasty being the same thing. That's not true, and I'm going to go into more detail onto why that is in this presentation. So, pederasty, in a general sense, is just any kind of interaction between an older individual and a younger individual, usually males, that can result in sexual interaction. That is not a great definition. However, if we use that definition, we can see that throughout human history, pederasty has existed in that form. Now, was it only sexual throughout all of those different, ancient forms? No. In fact, it differed widely between the forms, and I'm going to go into more detail on that later. If we look at a modern perspective, though, this map here shows the age of consent throughout the world. This map is from 2009. You can see that in numerous parts of the world, in the Americas, in Asia, in the Middle East, and even to a degree in Europe, the reality is that the age of consent is well within the pederastic age bracket, for youth. So we like to think that we're better than our ancestors were in doing these things, but realistically, we still don't know what differentiates a boy from a man, a child from an adult, and clearly we're not all at a consensus here, and that's something that we need to discuss, not just as citizens of the world, but citizens of our individual nations. I live in the state of Texas. There, sexual consent is 17. Just across the border, sexual consent is just as low as 9. So there's clearly a lack of consensus here on what makes pedophilia or pederasty so bad intrinsically all across the globe. We need to first encounter the difference between what we are calling pederasty from an ancient perspective and what currently exists today, which is much more on the lines of pedophilia. Pederasty in ancient times was not seen as a way to exploit children. Certainly there was sex with children, and looking at the map that I just showed, there's plenty of sex with children today. If you can go to Mexico or South Asia or the Middle East, or even if you go to Europe and you're able to have sex with children as young as 12 or 13, clearly there's a little bit of overlap there. But the goal with pederasty in ancient times was to develop the youth, the male youth specifically. We don't see that in modern pedophilia. There's no focus on trying to make sure the children that are being exploited have any access to health care or education or any other support. Ancient pederasty did have all of those things as concerns. So, making a blanket statement that all pederasty is pedophilia and so forth, that's just not true. And it really cheapens thousands of years of human history that have led us to our modern situation today. So one of the main reasons that pederasty doesn't get talked about is because people feel shame in even having the discussion. They're not the same, pederasty and pedophilia, but unfortunately pedophilia gets so much bad attention that people who know the difference are afraid that talking about why they're different is going to label them as some kind of pedophile. That's very unfortunate because it ends up weakening the resources available to the youth that are affected by pedophilia. And And unfortunately, we like to believe that we're taking the moral high ground in our society, and saying nothing is, in my view, much worse than telling the truth. And the truth is that if we treat all male to male interactions like they are pedophilia, when in some cases they could be pederasty if we were to shape them in that way, we're essentially throwing away a tool of control. And that is unacceptable for a lot of reasons. I'm going to go into more detail in just a second here. One of the reasons why we shouldn't be throwing away our tools of control over the adult male population is that adult males are really not present in their children's lives anymore. Not to mention all of the children that just don't have fathers, 12 million in the United States. There are so many dual parent families now in the country that just don't have anywhere near the level of commitment from the father figure as there should be. And we're seeing all sorts of negative outcomes there. We're seeing young males turn to crime and drugs and violence and other negative influences to try to find some degree of masculinity because they're not finding it in the home. They're not being given a clear masculine guide in the home, and so they're going outside of the home into the world, which they're not prepared to encounter, to find that masculine driver. And it's leading them to all sorts of negative outcomes. And that's not to mention that our society, now being accepting of so many different things, is encouraging in many ways these young males to essentially give up their masculinity, or at the very least to give up their social responsibility to procreation and to civic involvement and so forth. And we're creating very individualist, consumerist young males that are not driven to support families or society in any form when they become adults. And that's a real issue. And it's starting all throughout their youth, and it's going into adulthood. It's not any one thing. It's so many different things compiling on them. And the ones that don't choose to give up their masculinity are often choosing suicide as a second option, which is not good either. We're seeing a huge uptick in suicide among some of the youngest males in the pederastic age bracket, which is a real shame. They shouldn't be considering suicide as a viable option to getting out of this broken system that we've created. So if we're not going to talk about the issues that they're facing and look at every possible solution here, then we're just as bad as telling them that they should go kill themselves, which is just an unacceptable option. We need to be realistic about the state of our adult male population as well. Child pornography is on the rise. It's been on the rise for decades now, but with the advent of the access that the internet has provided, it has just become unmanageable. We've seen huge upticks in child pornography. Now with the advent of AI, we're seeing even greater publishing and distribution of child pornography. And we're seeing that child pornography is hitting people at a younger and younger age on both sides of the equation. We're seeing that more and more minors are actually embracing child pornography, either watching it themselves or contributing to it in many cases. This figure over here, 42%, that was a study that was done with minors that had sent sexually explicit material, pictures, videos, to other individuals. 42% of them knew that the person they were sending that information to was over the age of 18. And they sent it anyway for whatever circumstance. Some of them sent it for money. Some of them sent it because they were just curious. Some of them sent it because they wanted some kind of significant other. But for whatever reason, 42% of them understood that the person they were sending this pornographic material to was over the age of 18, and they sent it anyway, willingly. The figure over here where you see 70%, that's 70% in a study of Spanish-speaking child pornography consumers, adults. 70% of them began consuming child pornography while they were still children. So, between those two figures alone, I mean, that kind of paints the narrative here. Not only have we made child pornography standard, we've normalized it because of how much there is and just how poor of a job we're doing at suppressing it, but we've also de facto standardized the idea that children should willfully consume and even be a part of child pornography. That's a real issue. And, you know, with the increase of consumption of child pornography comes an increase of people looking to pursue sexual acts with children in the real world. That's what this 15% is showing here in the middle figure. That was a study in Canada, but it shows the same trend that we're seeing here in the Americas in general. As child pornography is becoming more and more ubiquitous, and as we're doing less and less to stop this pornography from becoming available, we're seeing a huge increase in the number of adults willing to go out into the real world and try to seduce a minor. Now, I didn't post the figure here because it wasn't convenient, but I saw another study where they were interviewing child abuse and sexual assault perpetrators. You know, child sexual abuse and sexual assault, adult sexual assault perpetrators, for what kind of pornography they were consuming online. Of them, the vast majority admitted in this study they were doing that they were willing to go online to pursue child pornography, and of those, 30% said that they were interested in pursuing male child pornography. So they wanted to see juvenile males explicitly, of those two groups combined. That tells us essentially that of the population of individuals who are interested in viewing and consuming child pornography, 30% of them are willing to pursue male child pornography. That's a huge quantity of people. And that kind of shows why our male population is increasingly, our juvenile male population is increasingly being targeted for these kinds of illicit sexual acts. But that's not where the problem ends. We have an increasing problem of young males being exposed to pornography at an early age. I've already talked about 42% of the young males, or of the children, not young males, but children, male and female, in that one study, were willing to send pornography to adults. Well, now we're seeing that over half of the young males and females of the age brackets 11 to 16, if you look at the pie chart in the middle, have seen pornography. And for whatever reason they saw it, it's well understood that the males are much more likely to search for it after seeing it than the females are. So once they're exposed at 11 years old, they're going to begin watching it regularly. In this study, it shows 59% were more likely to continue watching pornography regardless of how they were exposed to it. We also have the issue of them starting at such an early age, resulting in them oftentimes developing more deviant pornographic preferences, more deviant sexual preferences. For instance, they'll begin watching bestiality, child abuse, child pornography, as well as rape, gore, and other very deviant sexual fetishes. And at that early age, when they begin watching these kinds of things for greater sexual pleasure, for greater sexual satisfaction, the outcomes are universally negative as they go into adulthood. The chart here on the far right shows that males who watch pornography in their childhoods often struggle significantly with the social aspects of sexual intercourse and relationship building, which just feeds back into this cycle of them going back to looking at things that were sexually pleasurable. So if you start them off at an early age watching pornography, they end up deviating into things like child pornography, and then as adults, they can't find that sexual satisfaction with regular people. So what do? They go back to watching child pornography like they did as children. It's just a self-fulfilling cycle. We need to nip this in the bud if we're going to do anything about the epidemic of child abuse that we're currently turning a blind eye to, because it's not morally convenient to admit there's a problem. So if we're going to do anything about the sexual abuse crisis, especially affecting our young male population, we need to talk about the differences between just sexual attraction to young males and an actual sense of obligation to them. Ancient pederasty, as I alluded to before, was not about having sex with males. Certainly the male body, especially the juvenile male body, was a pinnacle of observation. It was something that was taken great pride into, but it was not something that was seen as a sexual tool to be exploited, at least not in classical pederastic circumstances. Now, it differed from region to region. I'm going to discuss that in more detail later, but pederasty in an ancient sense was never meant to be anything like the pedophilia that we have today. And we need to be realistic when we're talking about male-to-male interactions between juveniles and adults. When you have individuals that are in a close age bracket, they're more likely to interact with each other intimately, just by way of being able to relate to one another. And ancient pederasty was in the same way a very intimate circumstance. We need to remember that ancient pederasty was practiced by people who, on average, lived 25 years old. In ancient Greece, that was the age, life expectancy. So in a system like that, you don't have the luxury of being able to raise your own kid. I mean, if you think logically, if you get to 13 years old, if you survive childhood, which was not guaranteed, and you get to the age of 13, it's relatively likely that by the time your child is 13 years old, you will be dead. I mean, 13 is optimum childbearing age for a juvenile male. You know, at 12, at 11, he might be able to produce offspring, but it's questionable. At 13, he's probably got functional reproductive organs. But you don't have time in an ancient society to wait until you're established as an adult to then have children. No, you have to have children immediately, because most of them are going to die. Your wife is probably going to die after her second or third child. So realistically, you have to have children as much as possible, and you have to hope that some of them make it to adulthood. That kind of system requires a nuanced approach. If you're going to maintain a society, you have to have some different way of raising those children than each individual parent being responsible. That's where they came up with their reconsideration system. And so essentially, the individual who was 5 years older than you was going to raise you through your teenage years. And then once you were 18, you were going to raise an individual 5 years younger than you. And the cycle continued and continued and continued. This colorful graphic at the bottom here kind of summarizes what I've written out. If you had 4 or 5 families, you could essentially sustain the child rearing for all of those families if you had your children at specific times for each family. So each family would have a child at a very specific time, and as those children grew up, they would raise each other. And so the abilities of the society, the culture of the society would be passed down from family to family through the generations, and in doing so, they were able to sustain their society at a much more complex way than any of their counterparts were. And that's why in ancient Greece, for thousands of years, the city-states of ancient Greece, Sparta, Athens, so forth, were so successful compared to the Germanic tribes to the north, or the who would become the Romans to the west. All of these different ethnic groups that surrounded them struggled to establish lasting societies because they simply couldn't transfer the information, the knowledge that they had gained from generation to generation, anywhere near as well as the Greeks could by using this system. So we need to talk in more detail about what exactly the Greeks were teaching if we're going to get to the bottom of why pederasty should be reconsidered. If you look at their structure, they were very focused on the fundamental character traits of what they considered an ideal Greek citizen. The ideal Greek citizen needed to be physically capable, mentally of great acumen, and emotionally stable. And you can see how these things led into other parts of Greek social life. For instance, the Greeks prized physicality, but they also understood that brute strength was not everything. You know, the Greek political apparatus required a great deal of mental acuity, a great deal of sense when it came to dealing with things that would affect the community, as well as their foreign relations. You have to remember, each Greek city-state was on its own, and that's a very precarious situation to be in. And so you needed very strong, capable citizens in your society just to survive. Now, this led into a lot of the things that people have a lot of criticism for in our modern take on pederasty. For instance, physical and emotional traits lead into sexual traits. That's the natural course of things. Physicality paired with emotional sense is what makes sex possible between humans. That's just how it works. It's a physical and an emotional interaction. And so there was some focus on the sexual concerns of masculinity and adolescence, but that was just one piece of a much larger puzzle that had to be filled in by the erastes, by the older male, in the preparation of the youth to become a citizen. So while we focus a lot on that in our modern age, and we have the luxury of hindsight and judging people by our current standards, we need to remember that, one, they were very close in age, and two, it made a lot of sense for them to train their youth on how to be good, decent citizens in a sexual way, just as they would in a social way, in a spiritual way, in a financial way, in a judicial way. I mean, there were a lot of different things that they had to teach them. And teaching them the norms of society, especially at that early age, meant that they were not going to deviate nearly as much as we see people deviating today. You remember just a few slides ago, we're getting worse and worse at preparing our youth to be good members of society in every regard, but especially in the sexual regard. We are struggling heavily with the sexualization of our children. They explicitly interacted sexually with the young males of their society that were in this eromenos erastes system, with the goal of teaching them not to exploit other people, that sex was a sacred component of their well-being, just in the same way that spirituality, connection to the gods, was a sacred form of their well-being, and that it should not be exploited. And I think that's the differentiation that we need to make between pedophilia, which is just wanton sex, and pederasty, which is the real engendering of discipline through exposure to things that could be taken for granted. Now, if we're going to talk about pederasty in a modern sense, we need to be a little more realistic. We do live in the 21st century. People are not going to openly advocate for sex with young males in our society. That's not true around the rest of the world. There are a lot of places where they still do. But certainly in our society, we're not going to see people just openly, proclaiming that having sex with young males is the way to go. But that does not mean that the other components of the pederastic system are not valuable, and it does not mean that we should not discount sexual intercourse entirely. from a modern pederastic approach. As I was saying before, it could be beneficial to young males to have a guide through the course of their adolescent periods for all aspects of adolescent concern, including the sexual aspects. I certainly would argue, based on my anecdotal experience with other males, that it would have been better if young males of my age bracket, and especially those younger than me, had some guidance on how they should see their bodies, and more importantly, how they should interact with the bodies of those around them. In a slide earlier than this, I talked about 12% of the males in my generation now identify as some form of LGBT. Generation Alpha is expected to be as much as 25% or greater of their males, so 1 in 4. Right now it's 1 in 10 for us, a little more than that, 1 in 4 for them are projected to identify as LGBT. That's not sustainable. And look, I am not looking to say that people should live their lives a certain way, but realistically, if you're gay, you're not going to have children most of the time. If you're gay, you're going to have another male partner, and if you have children of any kind, they're going to be adopted or surrogate or something. They're not going to be natural because you can't have a child through homosexual intercourse. So realistically, it would be good to guide them on all fronts, including sexual, because you could deal with that deviance in childhood, give them an outlet where they can experience that homosexual interaction, and then show them why it's important for them to have wives and children, which is what they did in ancient Greek society. The Erastes, the older male, had a wife and children and child already, probably more than one child, already when they became the Erastes. So they had an eromenos, but they had a wife and child at the same time, and it was fully expected that the eromenos would have children as soon as sexually capable. Now, in a practical modern sense, we're more concerned with what the child is going to get in terms of moving into adulthood. And there's a lot to gain in terms of what the child is exposed to from the modern Erastes equivalent. If you have two individuals who are relatively close in age, which back then it was 18-year-old Erastes, 13-year-old Eromenos. If you have even a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old even, potentially, Erastes and a 13-year-old Eromenos, in today's context, that's really not that big of a deal. We live so much longer than people used to live in ancient Greece. There's no real point in us discriminating between them being 18 and 13 and 20 and 13 or 25 and 13, so long as the relationship is not exploitative. And that's the real takeaway here. The goal of ancient Greek pederasty, in particular, was to develop the youth. If you can develop the youth at 18 or 20 or 25, whenever is suitable, that's the goal. And if the youth is willing to interact closely, intimately, maybe not sexually, but at the very least intimately, with that older male who can guide them through what it means to become an adult and what it means to be a responsible adult male citizen in society, that's a good thing, and we should be encouraging that in any form. And now, I've added these two pictures here at the bottom. The one at the right is not mine. I pulled that from Big Brothers, Big Sisters, which I very much so advocate for. Big Brothers, Big Sisters, just like every civic institution that I can think of, is modeled after the same fundamental principles of the pederastic system of ancient Greece. You know, they're concerned with the mental, physical, and emotional development of the child. Now, certainly, I don't think that they're going to go into as much intimate detail in those concerns as the ancient Greeks did. But certainly, they are looking to develop the child in much the same way that ancient Greece was looking to develop the child. We're not allowed to do certain things in our modern way of living, but it's essentially the same functional development strategy. The picture to the left is actually one of my pictures. I have neighbors up the street from me that I've gotten closer to over the years, and one of them has a 9-year-old son. His best friend is a 10-year-old who comes over pretty much all the time. They're both impoverished. They both have either a father in the house that isn't really prepared for fatherhood or no father at all. The 10-year-old doesn't have a father. The 9-year-old has a father that's not really present. And so it's the exact same situation played out over, 3,000 years later, where I feel like I am obligated. I'm an Eagle Scout. I know what scouting did for me, my civic institution that developed me mentally, physically, and emotionally. I feel obligated to develop these young males mentally, physically, and emotionally, just in the same way that all the other civic institutions and religious institutions and so forth also feel obligated. So it's not that we don't have pederasty in society today. It's still pederasty. I consider it pederasty for, I'm 26, for a 26-year-old to want to interact with a 9 and a 10-year-old in any regard. Now, I'm not looking to have sex with these kids, but the fact that I'm interacting with them so closely, to me, is pederastic. That is pederasty. And it's because we conflate pederasty with pedophilia that everyone assumes that there has to be sex involved for it to be pederastic. That's entirely false. It's pederastic just to want to help a child. And so, if we can start having that discussion, that would be a great takeaway from this presentation. It's not that we don't have pederasty; it's that we're unwilling to acknowledge pederasty. Now, we need to take a step back and acknowledge also that pederasty is not great in every form. Ancient Greek pederasty was wonderful in terms of its outcomes. There was a strict adherence to social customs in the implementation of Greek pederasty. It was expected that the erastes, the older male, would accomplish a whole slew of objectives with the eromenos. Sex was a minor part of what they were doing. In fact, if you look at the ancient Greek literature on pederasty, the vast majority of it concerns developing them for political life, developing them for religious and social aspects of adult life, developing them physically, especially in the concern of war and the defense of the city-states. I mean, that's what's primarily talked about in these ancient Greek manuscripts. We hardly ever see any mention of the sexual aspects, and nowhere that I have seen is there an explicit outline of what kind of sex they were going to have, whether it's, anal, oral, other forms. And so, realistically, in ancient Greek society, the sexual part of it was a very small part. Now, of course, they left the door open for sex because of the reasons I've mentioned, which are just as applicable today. Young males are horny. Young males interacting with anyone closely that's not their biological father, they're going to become attached to that person. And they might eventually want to have sexual intercourse with that person. That's not far-fetched. We see this happen all the time in modern society. In fact, statutorial limitations continue to catch people in this way, even when they're only 3 or 4 years apart. Now, in terms of 5, 6, 10 years apart, maybe there's more to be looked at there, but certainly in their system, they understood very early on it doesn't make sense to criminalize them having sex if it's for the sake of the development of the youth, and overall, it was. Now, if you look at the other forms of pederasty throughout the world, that wasn't always the case. In pre-Meiji Japan, for example, there was a form of pederasty, although it was more occupational based. The samurai of that time had apprentices, and it wasn't just samurai, but in the case that I'm referencing, the samurai would have apprentices, and those apprentices that were more intimate often got favorable treatment. And so it was encouraged implicitly in their society that if you wanted to gain something, you might want to make yourself available to those people who were above you. And so there was some sexual exchange there. But they did benefit. They did benefit quite dramatically. Those apprentices that got close to their masters, be them samurai or people in the private sector, they often got favorable treatment, and they did better off in their occupations later in life. So that was a very positive, albeit less desirable, form of pederasty. You go to Han Dynasty China, they had a very different form of pederasty. They embraced the idea of male castration during youth. And so, unfortunately, males were castrated in youth and sent to be either entertainers or sexual slaves, essentially, for the royal families of their time. But it didn't come without benefits for the family. The family that chose to give their child away, their young son away to the royal family to become a eunuch, generally benefited quite dramatically. And so, more often than not, those were poor families with numerous children. And so, by giving one of their sons away to be a eunuch, the rest of their children actually had a real chance of thriving in adulthood by way of the favors granted onto them by the royal family. And so, yes, there was the sacrifice of one male, but the other children, male and female, in that family had a chance of survival. So it still was a beneficial process. Still, of course, not as good as Japan or certainly Greece, but it was better. Now, when you get to ancient Rome and the Middle Eastern applications of pederasty, for instance, bakabazi, if I'm saying that correctly, those are more on the lines of pedophilia, in my opinion. In ancient Rome, it was entirely sexual. There was no developmental goal, and it was more a show of dominance for an adult male to have sex with a youth male. Now, they had rules. You couldn't have sex with a youth male that was a freeborn Roman citizen, but you could have sex with any other male, and there were plenty of other males. There were males from outside of Rome that lived within Rome but weren't citizens. They were free game. There were males that were slaves. They were free game. And so there were plenty of males available. In fact, there were male prostitutes of juvenile age that were available in this regard. They weren't treated negatively. They weren't, murdered after being, sexually exploited. But certainly there weren't any favors given to them. When you get to the Middle East interpretation, especially in the modern evolution of what they used to be, it has become quite grotesque. Children are kidnapped, brutally raped, 12 years old, brutally raped, and then murdered afterwards quite often. It's not very good for the children that aren't murdered. They end up being sexually exploited well into adulthood, and then they're ostracized as adults because everyone knows that they were exploited as children. It's just not a good situation at all. And so this is all just to say that we have an obligation when discussing ancient pederasty, and certainly any modern application of it, to be aware of where it could go wrong, and we need to set up the appropriate balances to ensure that we don't allow pederasty to devolve into pedophilia. But the takeaway that I want to give here is that all throughout human history we've had it, we've just chosen what to do with it. Ancient Greece did a great job with it. And realistically, we have pederasty today in the form of pedophilia, gross and unmanaged pedophilia. So if we're going to have pedophilia anyway today, and we have Jeffrey Epstein and all these, modern scandals just showing how entrenched pedophilia is, if we're going to have it, we should have the ancient Greek version. That's my argument. We can't get rid of it. That's obvious. It's getting worse. So we need to embrace the form that's going to help our children the best degree possible. Now, of course, we have alternatives to pederasty. Boy Scouts. I'm an Eagle Scout. I'm very proud of being an Eagle Scout. It's my proudest achievement. The only greater achievement that I can think of would be being a father and having my sons become Eagle Scouts. That would be really great in my eyes. And I hope to do that one day. Right now, I'm just not there yet. I'm 26 and I'm living in, 2025 America. There is a lot in the way of me building a family right now. But I'm working towards that goal, and I'd certainly continue to vouch for and preach the praises of Boy Scouts. I think Boy Scouting is a great organization, and it's a shame that it's seen such abandonment by society today because of the scandals and other things. And that's true across the board. We're seeing a real drawback of American youth, and more importantly, a drawback of the support of American parents of these civic institutions, whether they be scouting, the church, through government, or even youth sports. We're seeing a lot of drawback because parents today are saying, well, there could be a pedophile somewhere in those organizations, so we're just not going to let our children be involved at all. What they're really doing is opening the door for the exploitation of their children later in life or through other means, for instance, online. So we need to be realistic. Nowhere is perfect. You can't get rid of pedophilia anywhere. I mean, I've already talked about that. It's on the rise. All across the world, child exploitation is on the rise. So the idea that we're going to get rid of it just by shutting our eyes to it, we already know that's not the solution. But unfortunately, if we're not going to let these good civic and religious and governmental organizations help to guide our youth, we need to do better as parents. And if we're not going to do that, then we need to consider other options like pederasty. I've made this presentation not to advocate so much for pederasty as much as to begin a discussion on where we are as society. Certainly, my personal view is that pederasty is better than nothing. And that's not to say that it's a good thing. I don't think that sexually exploiting minors is good in any case, but they're already being sexually exploited. That's the reality. They're being exploited, and they're being exploited in the worst way possible. And even where they're not being exploited, no one's raising them. We have so many young men in my generation that have just given up on building families, working a meaningful job, trying to buy a house, anything, being involved in the community. They've just given up. They've shut themselves out of society completely. And we're seeing an uptick in that. We're seeing an uptick in young families deciding not to have children because they can't afford them or they think of children as a burden. I mean, that's the antithesis of what we should want in society. We should want our young males and females to be involved in the communities, to be involved in their civic institutions, to want to have strong, stable families, and to want to have children who are going to continue their legacy, and we just don't have that. Now, I was fortunate enough to be raised in a community that really rounded me quite well. I've been raised to have a very strong connection to nature. I have a great appreciation for the arts. I have a great appreciation for masculine traits. I believe physicality is one of the greatest things that males have available to them, and physical strength is not a hazard. There's no such thing as toxic masculinity, but there is a such thing as a toxic community. And I'm very fortunate to have been raised the way I was. Unfortunately, a lot of youth today are not being raised that way. In fact, I have met very few people who have had my experience. So this is not me saying that we should just start having sex with our young males. That's not at all. What I am trying to say is we need to reconsider how we're approaching youth male development. The young male population in our country and throughout the world is struggling severely. And if we're not going to do something to help them ourselves, then we need to get out of the way so that other people can help them in a conducive manner for their development. Anyway, my name is Zach Alexander. I'm 26. I've been thinking about how to write this presentation for 8 years now. I'm finally doing it because of the circumstances. I'm actually injured right now. And so the timing and the circumstances just worked out for me to be able to make this. I intend on making more presentations on this theme. This is not going to be a one-time presentation. But certainly I hope that this presentation brings forth a little more discussion on the topic. Our male youth are struggling. They don't know who they are or what they're supposed to do with their lives, and it's our obligation as the preceding generations to give them every tool available, even if it's a tool that we are too ashamed to talk about. Pederasty might be a solution. I'm not saying it is. I still advocate for Boy Scouts and Big Brothers, Big Sisters and everything, but if pederasty is something that can step in and help, especially when these other organizations just aren't available in many cases, and when parents just don't make themselves available to their children, then by all means we need to do what's best for our youth. And if that means changing some laws and changing some cultural norms, then so be it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope that I spur some discussion. I'm going to leave some links in the comment section or in the description of the video for more reading material. So if you'd like to see where I've gotten some of my motivation for this presentation, I'll leave the links there. And there's a playlist titled Aeromenos that I'm going to link to this presentation that shows just anecdotal evidence that I've encountered on YouTube of all of the different times that having a pederastic system would have been better to what I observed. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed.